Hello, Alan. Thank you so much for joining me in this podcast to discuss your latest book and Newcomers, which, as you know, I found extremely intriguing and exciting and extremely well read. And so, welcome to our conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here with you.
Yes. So, I mean, besides the historical facts you mentioned in the book, the date and everything else, what the first thing that is striking is your interest in this character, and you find ways, both in Newcomers and in some other ways as well. I mean, I cannot talk, with with enough confidence about God's shadow. But in God's shadow, you also find ways to connect the distant past to the present, to the American present, even. And tell me more about that inclination. It's not very common.
hmm Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, obviously, your work has been path-breaking in this regard. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how you see it, but in my sense, I think of myself first and foremost as a history of the Middle East and of global Islam. And it strikes me that in the history of global Islam, the Americas is probably the least understood piece of that story. And it is a piece of that story, as you well know. And as I've tried to show in different ways in God's Shadow and now in Newcomers. As I try to argue in God's Shadow, from 1492, from the beginning of European colonization in the Americas, Islam had a presence. It was a complicated one. It was often in the realm of fantasy, but it plays a very important role. And so I think it behooves us as historians, especially of the early modern period, let's say, and of the 19th century, to uncover that history of Islam in the Americas. For the 20th century, it's a little bit more well known once we start having, more familiar narratives about immigration to the United States and to Brazil and things like that. But the earlier history is harder to recover, and it is harder to recover. But it's very worthwhile, and I think it also it helps us to kind of reorient our understandings of the Americas and also of the history of Islam. Right? How were the Americas a part of the global history of Islam? That's really what I'm interested in.
Yeah, in God's shadow, you said, and I'm quoting, no group has been vilified longer than in the Americas than Muslims. So, and because as you talk about this history, the connection, as you make the connection between Christopher Columbus and later conquistadors and what happened in the Americas and their relationship to Islam. And so it's a kind of, so it kind of, you find echoes of that in Newcomers, because here we have Anthony Jansen also being labeled as Turk or Mohammedan or Muslim for reasons we don't fully understand. Your book does an incredible. I mean, that should be the final the recommended reading for everyone who's trying to understand this kind of the ambiguity related to how people come to be identified as such. And so here's a person who shows up in Amsterdam, and and for some mysterious or not inexplicable reasons, he's labeled as Muslim, Turk, Mohammedan for the rest of his life. Has I mean, you try to elucidate that in the book, and you do an incredible job, but it sounds like an investigative work. It's not. We don't know whether he was actually the son of Muhammad of Murad al-Rais, or who was Jan Jansen, the Dutch renegade, or is he just was held captive in some other place? We don't know why he acquired that designation, right?
Yeah, I mean, I offer theories as to why in the book, but I think
Yes.
you point to the central conundrum in Anthony's story, which is how is it that this person who marries twice in the Dutch Reformed Church, baptizes a daughter, asks for a minister to be assigned to his location in Long Island once he and Gritia live there, who projects Christianity in all the actions that suggest a religion at all, never does anything that we might construe as quote unquote Muslim. How is it that this person comes in the historical record to be referred to in all the ways you described, always as a Muslim? And
Yes.
so
Yes.
that's one of the things that I want to elucidate in the book. And you know, the overall kind of point, and we can get into the details, is that this label of him as being from somewhere in Morocco, even that is unclear where exactly, of being a Mohammedan, as the sources call him, of being a Turk. All of that says more about those who are calling him those things than it does about him. And it says a lot about the place of Islam in the Atlantic world, in New Netherland, in European thought in the 17th century.
Yeah. Yes. It's amazing how those connections are made. Today, as I was looking through your book, God's Shadow, I was wondering, and you kind of mentioned that we tend to forget that the Ottoman Empire was a major political force for centuries, up until perhaps until the early 19th century. It was one of the most dominant forces, and we tend to forget that now. And and then it led me into thinking: could he have been called a Turk, and not, let's say, a Moroccan, because Turk was the most powerful and the most dominant Islamic force in the European consciousness in the 17th century.
Absolutely. I would take it even a step further and say that the reason Turk comes to be a stand-in for any Muslim, right? Not necessarily someone from the Ottoman Empire, not necessarily an ethnic Turk, is precisely because of the political and kind of existential power of the Ottomans for Europeans.
Very interesting. Yes. And then you have this question of, now we go back. You talked about Columbus and John. The Mayflower had traded with the Mediterranean before it sailed across the Atlantic to come to bring the pilgrims to the Americas. And then you have also John Smith, the founder of Jamestown, who had been enslaved, or who was enslaved by the Turks for a few years. And then he has his coat of arms with the severed heads of three Turks. And on the bottom of that, there's this Latin dictum that says, what is it? Kind of vincere. I'm trying to remember the exact wording of that dictum. To conquer is to live.
Exactly.
Vincere est vivere.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So here you have this just visually, these very strong visuals of, here you have this coat of arms on one hand, symbolizing, the triumph over Islam, and you have Christopher Columbus and the what came after him in terms of the conquest of the Americas. So it does sound like the discovery, quote unquote, of the America is an extension of the Christian wars on Islam.
Absolutely. And that's, for Ferdinand and Isabella, this is the language that they use when they agree to fund Columbus's voyages, that, after the Reconquista, that this is part of the global march of Catholicism against Islam, right? In their minds, it is to get around the Ottomans and Mamluks and others who are in control in the Middle East, to find a route to India, to circumvent that political and economic power. But it is part of their kind of global effort against Islam. So we have to think about it as a kind of motivating factor for Columbus's voyages, and he's very clear about that. In the first page of the diary, of making clear that these two things go together: Reconquista and sailing west to India, in his mind. And we tend to separate those things. 1492 can mean Columbus's Atlantic voyages. It can mean the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. It can mean the Reconquista. In Columbus's mind, in the minds of Ferdinand and Isabella, all those things go together. They shouldn't be separated. So part of the work that I'm trying to do is to hold all those things together, to tell a story that brings all of them in to help us to understand how it is that the Americas comes to be shaped in this, in Columbus's case, in the very first decades, right? And so the argument that, Islam is one of the oldest imports to the Americas is precisely that, right? That it comes in Columbus's mind when he lands, when he initially sets sail, and then once he lands in the Caribbean, what we now call the Caribbean. And you see that in the way that he describes Taino women as wearing things that look to him as if they are Moorish sashes. That is the phrase that he used, right? Or describing certain weapons as those of Muslims in Spain, right? So using the language of Islam to understand these initial encounters with people that he's encountering for the first time, months after he's initially left Spain as part of furthering the Reconquista of the Spanish against Islam. So before Protestantism, right before the English, before any other Europeans arrive in the Americas, we have a kind of presence of Islam there already in 1492. And very soon thereafter, it's only a few decades in which we have the first, what we might say, living, breathing Muslims in the Americas, and those are enslaved West Africans who are brought to work on Spanish plantations in places like Hispaniola. So all of that history is there from the very beginning, and I think we can tell a continuous history of Islam in the Americas from 1492 to today. And so, some of that work begins for me in God's Shadow and in the discussion around Columbus. And Anthony's story is a piece of that continuous history. Very different from Columbus. We're talking different places, different European power, of course, a different period, a whole set of different issues, but nevertheless part of this larger story of Islam in America.
Wonderful. As you are speaking, I'm just thinking about, I have a bunch of questions, which of course we don't have to answer right now. But do you think there's a difference between the way the Spaniards or the treat Islam in their literature, during this time period, compared to how the British and the Northern Europe, the Dutch, for example, described or treated Islam? Is it the same kind of treatment, or could you notice or decipher some kind of nuanced differences between the two? I don't know. As you are speaking, I'm thinking, because we know that Spain had direct contact with Islam for centuries, and they dealt with Islam in a very real way. The British and the Dutch had been trading nations. They dealt with Islam in a different kind of way. And I wonder whether you could notice the differences in the way they related to Islam, where they talked about Islam, both in the part that Spain occupied and also in Northern America, where the British were prevalent.
Yeah, I mean, very, very large differences, I would say, between, let's say, the Spanish and the Dutch, right? To stick with, the main subject of newcomers. And we can talk about the British too, if you like. But
Yes.
as you say, right, there's a Muslim presence for, close to a millennium in Spain, in a way that there's not in the Netherlands in any equivalent sort of way. There are Muslim states in Iberia, obviously, in a way that is not the case in Northern Europe. Spain is in direct military confrontation with Muslim powers in Iberia itself, and then the Ottomans and a little bit in West Africa also, in a way that is not necessarily the case for the Dutch. the Dutch relationship to Islam in the 17th century is usually mediated through captivity, right? So that's the
Hmm.
story of Jan Jansen turned Murat Reis. And then increasingly through treaty. So some of the
Hmm.
first treaties that North African powers sign with Europeans are with the Dutch. And the Dutch trading
Hmm.
relationships with North Africa are very long-standing, some of their oldest. In part, that is precisely in opposition to the Spanish, right? The Spanish and the Dutch are fighting a war for 80 years, not that entire period, of course, but are back and forth, and so the enemy of one's enemy is one's ally, of course. So in some measure, the North African powers and the Dutch have a common enemy in Spain. Um, Another way this relationship goes for the Dutch is that many Moriscos, when they're expelled from Spain, in the
Yeah.
way that Sephardic Jews had earlier, make their way to the Netherlands. And
Yeah.
some of the first collections of Arabic manuscripts in a place like Leiden, which becomes obviously a center of Orientalist knowledge, is brought with these Morisco refugees from Spain who come to
Hmm.
settle in the Netherlands. So it's a very different relationship. I don't want to say copacetic, plenty of conflict, of course, but one that is much more mediated and much more overall mixed positive and negative interactions between the Dutch and Islam writ large. And we should say also, obviously, and I should have maybe begun with this, the most intense relationship the Dutch have with Islam is in Southeast Asia, right? Their
Yeah.
largest imperial holdings for centuries into the 20th century are in Southeast Asia. And so, Dutch Orientalists are interested in Islam in Southeast Asia. It's its most lucrative imperial holding, right? The Atlantic world is a complete afterthought for the Dutch, right? Southeast Asia is really where the action is, and even in the Atlantic, New Netherland is a complete backwater, is just nothing, right? Brazil is really the most important place for the Dutch in the Atlantic. Nevertheless, the most intense relationships the Dutch have with Islam are in Southeast Asia with Muslim majority populations there. And I would say it's interesting that the historiographies of the two places of Spain and the Netherlands are obviously, vastly complex. But on this specific question of Islam and thinking about religion, I would say Spanish historiography is very interested in this question. And again, I think that goes back to this kind of more intense, obviously, relationship with Islam having Muslim polities in Iberia. But the Dutch historiography is very interested in religion in all kinds of ways. Of course, Christianity,
Mm.
the wars of religion, and the multiple forms of Protestantism in which the Dutch, have a relationship to. Um, the relationship between Catholicism and Protestantism in the 80 Years' War, obviously, but later in the Netherlands. The question of Judaism in the Netherlands, Sephardic Judaism, and other forms of Judaism in the Netherlands. It's a historiography that is very interested in religion, and yet Islam plays a very small role in that historiography. Again, there's quite a bit on Islam in Southeast Asia, but I don't think really to the extent that we see about Christianity and Judaism. And so that's one of the modest contributions that I hope the book can at least alert us to,
Yes.
is that within Dutch imperial studies, much more attention needs to be paid to the role of Islam.
Yeah, absolutely. And you would think that because Iberian Jews migrated some of them migrated to Holland, that there would be some increased interest in us in the Moors as well, on the Muslims as well, because of that
Mhm.
migration. But it
Mhm.
hasn't happened. Didn't happen.
No, there's some. I don't want to say there. I mean, there's I can name scholars. There's plenty of very good work on the Moriscos in the Netherlands for sure. I don't want to say there's nothing. There's
Oh,
very good work, but there's a lot of room to do more. And not just on the question
yes,
of Moriscos, right? That's one way of getting at the story of Islam in
yes.
the Netherlands. There are many others about the diplomatic treaties with North Africa, and again, there's a lot of good work that's been done on that. Islam in Southeast Asia, the Dutch in parts of West Africa in which Islam is present, and many other kinds of things. There's an Orientalist tradition in thinking about early Dutch Orientalists in the 17th century, but there's more work to be done for sure.
Spain is so critical to the European Muslim or the Christian Muslim relationships. But somehow, in parts of the world, like the United States, I felt anyway that it tends to be overlooked because of the strong Anglo-Saxon influence over kind of scholarship that is being done. I don't know. I don't know whether it was your experience or not, but in the field of theory and that kind of thing. It's usually the French, the European, the British, and so on, but almost never, very rarely, the Spanish perspective. And yet, the Spanish perspective, Spain is crucial in establishing a lot of what we consider to be modern things today, like a nation state, or whether it's the treatment of minorities and stuff like that. But it's very interesting. So I'm saying this because I recently discovered there is a Moroccan historian who works in France, in Bordeaux, and through his work, I just came to realize that Moroccan history was done. The work was done initially by modern scholarship, basically by the French colonists, and many of them discovered early Moroccan history from the Almoravid and Almohads and so on through their discovery of Spain in the 19th century. So by going to Alhambra and discovering this Muslim heritage in Spain, it is through that heritage that they developed an interest in early Moroccan history and so on, because they saw the impact of Moroccan. So Spain is kind of critical in making this kind of connections, like you say.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely,
Yeah.
and I think just you're in Morocco right now. I'm in the United States. The English legacy kind of subsumes everything else. I mean, not just in this year of
Yes.
250, of course, but and you see this in the historiography of New Netherland, right? That New Netherland is a kind of blip, a kind of interesting, quirky, 40 years on the relentless march, inevitable march of, English colonies to United States. And so who loses out in that story? I mean, loses out is the wrong word, but, the dominant American historiography is focused primarily on the English, right? So the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, Scandinavian, loses out is not given the place I think it could usefully be provided in that historiography. And that's one of the, I think, interesting challenges of something like New Netherland, is that it it challenges that dominant narrative, right?
Yes, it
Um,
does.
yes. For some, I think they might say, well, it confirms various aspects of American history, right? So that um, a place like New York City represents the kind of liberal tradition, right? Tolerant, capitalist, multicultural, etc. That is an important part of American history, and so we need to pay attention to New Netherland for those reasons. Others would say, though, the Dutch, they didn't really affect much. They named some things, but there's no lasting influence of New Netherland on the United States. I'm agnostic in that regard. I'm not interested in arguing for or against whether New Netherlands should be the central aspect of American history. But it is the setting for the story of Anthony and Gricia. So I am interested in the way that it gets to be coded in American history, And to go back to what we were saying
Yeah.
earlier, within Dutch imperial history, the attention that's given to New Netherland is far less than other places within Dutch imperial history. Dutch imperial history within Dutch history overall is not a major aspect of that story. But within the imperial historiography, even New Netherland, were it not for it becoming New York City, I think would play even a far less prominent role than it does.
That's right. And now that, again, as you're speaking, I'm reminded of uh, Bradford's account of the pilgrims as they were as during their stay in Holland. He basically was complaining about what a dangerous place it was for the pilgrims. So they had to leave to go back to this new land. Holland did not, even though it was hospitable to them in the beginning, but it was not a place they wanted to stay. It's like it was basically imperiled the mores of their children, and it had it could have had a negative impact on them because of the
Mm.
kind of liberal culture that existed in Holland. So that kind of it's interesting that I'm thinking of Bradford's account of
Hmm.
the pilgrims. Um, Another question is something personal, right? I mean, why are we so eager to identify with some forgotten or lost or unmentioned founder of the Americas? Let's say, in this case, is Anthony Jansen, but in Morocco, they're about to sanctify this person, Estebanico, as the founder, as the early Moroccan who discovered the Southwest and stuff like. There is this kind of uh, uh, strong desire to claim such
Mm.
people as one of our own,
Mm.
even though in the case of of Jansen, there is absolutely no proof that he was Moroccan or anything else. But like in Brooklyn, you said the Muslims of Brooklyn are claiming him as the first, you know.
Hmm.
Uh, I can't remember exactly, but it was like he was the first. He built the first house in Brooklyn. I can't remember exactly. I mean, I can have
Yeah,
to
they
look it
claim him
up.
as
I mean,
the first
so
Muslim of Brooklyn. Yeah,
yeah, the
the
first
first
Muslim of
Muslim of
Brooklyn,
Brooklyn. Yeah.
and the first Muslim of Brooklyn. Now, why? I mean, you don't find that same desire. Let's say they don't find Muslims trying to claim some first Muslim of you know. I don't know, Argentina, Zimbabwe, or some other place. They try. Is it a this kind of desire? This kind of problematic, in my view, desire to be associated, to have a place, to have a claim to the United States because the United States is a
Mhm.
superpower and dominates the world right now.
Yeah, I agree with you that this whole politics of origins is highly problematic, and I try to be critical of it in the book. Um, I
Yes.
mean, there's so much to say here. I mean, one is we invest a question of origins as somehow lending legitimacy, authenticity, ownership over something. Right. Now, in this
Exactly.
entire discussion, especially of the Americas, right, not to talk about other places, it
Yes.
is the millions of native peoples of the Americas who are the rightful owners of these continents, right? And we always have to keep that in mind. And in the book, I try to do the history of the native nations. I try to do it justice in what we now call New York Harbor, Lenape, Canarsie, Hackensack, Massapequa, many others. But we think that somehow if we can claim that Estebanico was the first, non-native person, right, to enter New Mexico, what is today New Mexico, or if Anthony Jansen is the first Muslim or the first non-native, potentially the first non-native person on Long Island to settle on Long Island, let's say, in any kind of permanent way. that somehow gives claims in the present for Muslims, for Moroccans over New Mexico or over New York. Now, we can understand that for a population like Muslims in New York City, who since 9/11, if not before, have been surveilled, harassed, made to feel unwelcome, like this isn't your home, etc. That, pointing to someone like Anthony, Muslim or not, but let's call him Muslim for these purposes, as someone who was there in the 17th century, who maybe was the first person to settle in Brooklyn, who was there before the Irish and the Italians and the Jews immigrated, at the turn of the 20th century. That gives us claims that this city is as much ours as anyone else's, right? Okay,
Yes.
that's I'm not interested in. I'm interested in analyzing that, but I don't think that politics matters, and I don't think that gives claims to anyone over anything. And I would say that, especially in the Americas now, specifically, it valorizes colonization. It valorizes the displacement of native peoples from their lands by saying, someone like Estebanico, who had a very vexed relationship with the Zuni, let's just say that, and other native
Mm-hmm.
peoples. Is that really the hero that we want to be, putting up on a pedestal? Or someone like Anthony and Gritia, for all their eccentricities and lives of real oppression, especially Gritia. They are in Long Island. They are colonists. They are displacing native peoples from their lands. They engage in a war against native peoples. Estebanico is part of as enslaved potentially as he was. He is part of the Spanish conquest of the Americas, right? He complicates that story. He offers us a way of talking about Islam. All of those things, yes, yes, yes. But at the end of the day, this is what we're talking about. So I'm not interested in heroes or villains. I'm interested in, giving voice to the complicated histories that exist. And history is always complicated. It's never good or
That's right.
bad. And so I think the narrative of origins, too quickly devolves into a story of heroes and villains. And so, I'm interested in critiquing it, right? But I'm not interested in doing it, obviously.
Yeah, I agree with you. What I find to be curious, I don't know. I'm sure you know more than I do because you have a vaster look at history. But it's people want to be associated. People want to claim origins have a with what they consider to be a powerful nation like the United States, but they won't even look at, let's say, a Moroccan who somehow found his way or her way to like Egypt, let's say, or some Egypt is much older than that. So to some other nation and played an interesting role in the development of that community, but nobody cares. People only care because the story involves the United States.
Yeah, I think that's maybe right. I would have to think a little bit more about that. I
Okay,
imagine we could
okay,
find other. I imagine we could find other examples. I mean, look, Spain is maybe a place here, right? So like, you know,
yes,
various polemicists on Arabic television will say, the Muslims in Spain founded all of these things that we think are Spanish. You know, that their
that's right,
origins are
that's
in
right.
Islam, right? Of course, the
Yes,
architecture, but various Spanish words, whatever. So that's a kind of argument about, and you could say it's a similar sort of politics. Like we want to be associated with Europe, which is better than the Arab world. So we're going to say that Spain was actually founded by Arabs or something like that. I mean, it's ridiculous, but those politics are certainly
yes.
there.
Well, the case of, again, once again, the case of Spain stands apart from the rest, because for Muslims anyway. So I've seen. I mean, I frequently used to talk about people from Pakistan and other places saying we need to reclaim Al Andalus, and
Hmm.
meanwhile, people who live in Tangier, which is which is almost but in Spain, uh, they never think like that. So that the more distant you are in the Islamic faith, on the Islamic community, the grander or the more claims you begin to develop out of a fantasy of belonging or some ownership. But people who are really neighbors of Spain, Muslims who live next to Spain, would never
Yeah.
think like that. That's why I was
Yeah.
curious about how the relationship, the differences between the Dutch and the Spanish treatment of Islam, because
Yeah.
the Spaniards are so close to Muslims, to the Islamic
Yeah.
culture,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
probably, it's not a fantasy, it's a reality. The more
Yeah.
distant you are from that reality, the more outlandish claims you may develop over the over those cultures.
Absolutely, and I totally agree with you. And I think that, in trying to make an argument about the impacts of Islam in the Americas, one can sort of quickly fall into that trap. And so I think we have to be careful about that. I think there's a way of telling that history that's does justice to a story about Islam in the Americas, but doesn't do this kind of knee jerk, fantastical, reactionary version to say that Islam is everything at all times in every place. But is able to hold that complexity and be clear about what we can know and what we can't know, for example, right? So there's a version of taking seriously the impact of Islam on Columbus, right? Which I try to do in God's Shadow. Um, and there's a version of it that, Recep Tayyip Erdogan said, Muslims discovered Cuba. Because he reads these accounts where Spanish accounts where they say they saw mezquitas in places, and he says, look, there were mosques, therefore Muslims discovered. So there's a ridiculous version of doing it, and there's a scholarly, honest, robust, rigorous way of doing it. Obviously, I'm trying to do the latter, not the former.
Yeah, it's a historical account, which is why your book is exceptionally great, because it really is an investigative study of the history of the making of Anthony Jansen and where he came from, all that stuff. But most people have emotional histories. They rely on emotional memories, which are
Mm,
very, in so many ways, anti-historical. Uh,
mm,
one a great example would be Al Andalus. Everybody talks like now about Al Andalus as the golden age of Islam, one of the golden ages of Islam, but nobody remembers that Spain was conquered by Muslims. There was a Spain before Islam. There was a
yeah,
Iberia before Islam.
right,
But
right.
it's that is erased from memory.
Hmm, yeah, yeah.
You know, just like the Islamic religion as well erases what comes before it, like Christianity and
Mm,
Judaism and all the ancient cultures of the Middle East. In other words,
mm,
it's basically history becomes like a blank. So it's a very interesting. So in the case of claiming origins in the United States, I found in my experiences, it's my friendly kind of difference with some of my colleagues and stuff like that. Like in the case of Estebanico, uh, I don't think there's a lot of information on its origins in Morocco and everything else, but everybody takes it as a like a like a like a like a fact, like a confirmed fact that he was born here. That there's it,
mm,
but there's very little documentation. I wish you could
mhm.
do that project, and settle this issue of Estebanico, you know.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly need more sources. I think it's just
Yes,
that one line that he's a what is it? An Arabic speaking black man, right? Um,
yes, yes.
and the novel the Moor's Account, right? I believe it's called Leila Lalami's
Yes,
novel, is an excellent novel, but
yes,
it lends itself to fiction. It's fictionalized. It's
yes,
a wonderful story. It's a wonderful book. The imaginings one can do are really interesting. But it's yeah, the historical source material I think is hard to come by. Just recently I was speaking with someone who was telling me that within Zuni tradition, there is a story about
hmm
Estevanico. So obviously that has to be included. But I wonder, the Zuni are not the only native peoples that, over this long voyage from Florida to Texas and walking overland that he and his party encounter. So it would be interesting to sort of to be able to trace through native accounts the story as best we can. But, like most people of the past, their stories are lost to us.
yes. You begin your story of in God's shadow talking about Matamoros in the
Mhm.
city. Is it in New Mexico or Texas?
No, Texas,
It's
on the
the city of
Texas Mexico border. Yeah.
Mexican border, and
Hmm.
of course, so it reminded me. And again, we're going back to these differences between Spain and other European nations and how they relate to Islam and they treat Islam. So, despite the kind of the violence implied in naming such a place, kill the Moors, but Spain also is a place that is most likely to understand Muslims. So
Hmm.
in the annual Fiestas de Moros y Cristianos,
Hmm.
which happened like 200 of them every year in Spain, throughout Spain.
Hmm.
They reenact the battles between between the Catholics and the Muslims and so on. Eventually, the Christians defeat the Muslims, but then in that encounter, in that clash, and of course, in one case, after the defeat of Muslims, somebody said, as you know, from one of the titles of one of my books, said that we are all. In the end, he showed his skin to the researcher, scholar. It said, in the end, we may have beaten we beat the Muslims, but we are all Moors. He showed his skin to prove it, and so there is this kind of uh, there's a feeling sometimes violently made denied, but of this intertwined civilizations. And so that's why I'm saying the case of Spain is really amazing and very particular. So
Hmm.
I was thinking of this Matamoros thing, and then I discovered that in Mexico they have several Fiestas de Moros y Cristianos.
Hmm.
They happen every
Across Latin
on an
America,
annual,
they occur.
yeah,
Yeah.
across Latin America. So
Hmm.
it's amazing that that tradition was exported to a place where there was no actual encounter with the Muslims.
Hmm. Sure. I mean,
Yeah,
the Inquisition is exported to the Spanish Americas as well. Caroline Cook has a fabulous book on this topic. And so yes, the imagination of Islam is one of the most important aspects of its history in the Americas, right? Seeing Muslims where they didn't exist. So, there's an
yeah,
account of, Ottoman ships off the western coast of what is today Chile, in the 17th century.
yeah.
Completely fantastical. There are no, the Ottomans were not in the Pacific. Well, that part of the Pacific at least. So it's, yeah, yeah.
Do you think that Anthony Jansen is a prototypical American today? Not as America was conceived
Yeah,
let's say the pilgrims on the Mayflower or whatever, but
yeah.
today is a prototypical American of secular America.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I I I I think he is in some ways. To get back to the question of origins, I don't want to claim too much for him, but I think he has symbolic possibilities for us to imagine other histories of the Americas. The in the United States. Let's just stick to the United States for the moment. When people speak about early American history, it is a story of white European settlers, um, enslaved Africans, and native peoples, right? It's usually that holy trinity. And that is a major, that is the story for sure, right? That is the you have to understand that history to understand anything about early America. And so I don't want to say that, but Anthony may have been a European settler. But he wasn't coded as such. He was coded as a Muslim from Morocco. So whatever the truth of his story, what he's imagined to be offers us a different trajectory, right? It's not part of that Holy Trinity. It comes from a different place. It comes from Morocco. It comes from the Muslim world. It comes from Islam. And so it allows us to tell a different history of America. And I think, that's useful in the present in that, there are many Americans today who feel that they're not captured by kind of the dominant, cultural spheres in the United States, whatever those might be. And those tend to be newer immigrants, right? So those are people from the Middle East, maybe South Asians, right? But increasingly a part of American public culture, but not in any kind of way in which they capture the imagination of cultural capital in the United States, right? Black culture is a very powerful force in the United States,
Yeah.
right? Euro-Christian culture, for lack of a better term, is, we can see that very present in the public sphere. Increasingly native politics, but of course that also is highly oppressed in the United States. But it's hard to say that Middle Eastern culture, South Asian culture has a dominant place on the American landscape. And I think that's changing. So Zoran Mamdani is an exemplar of that change, right? An immigrant to the United States, born in Africa, South Asian, Muslim, mayor of New York City. Anyway, so Anthony, I think, helps us to imagine those kinds of other immigrant histories to the United States, if you like, who are not the kind of dominant European immigrant story to the United States, or the story of Asian Americans, of Mexican Americans, other Latinos in the United States. So it is an opportunity to imagine a longer history, again, with all the unknowns present. And so I do very much want to say that Anthony is a kind of figure to tell histories of other Americans that have been left out of the kind of dominant American story.
Well, when people ask me about, I'm a first generation immigrant. I was born and raised in Morocco, came to the United States, and my children were born in the United States. My wife is American, and so I describe myself as a transition figure, like to whoever asks me that kind of question, how do you feel about the whole situation? And I know you were born in the United States, and so it's you're second generation. But I can see the question where, as talking about thinking of Anthony, his so-called descendants. I don't know whether whether they're genealogically confirmed or not, but people who claim descendants from him are very well established Americans, and those are the kinds of people I mentioned. They don't have the same identity issues. They're proud of their heritage, and they're also fully American in ways that Anthony could never have been.
Yeah, I mean, these are obviously very complicated questions, right? So, like, as the son of Egyptian immigrants to the United States, born actually not that far from Matamoros, in Texas,
Really?
I feel that, I mean, hundreds of miles away, but nevertheless in Texas, I whatever the cliches are, and in betweenness and neither here nor there, in both places, one foot in both places, I feel that, and that's changed over the course of my lifetime. Sometimes I felt much more American, other times much more Egyptian, and so that that's the common immigrant sort of story. But I see resonances for myself in the story of Anthony, right? Um, and and to get to your question, it's a story of this outsider, maligned figure, Anthony, um, who is also highly successful, becomes one of the
Yeah.
richest people in the colony, is there much longer than many other people whose daughters, four daughters that they have together, marry very, very well, whose descendants include the Vanderbilts and Warren G. Harding, right? So in some ways, you could tell a version of his immigrant story. I'm going to put that in quotes, um, of rags to riches, right? The American dream, right? Came from nowhere, married a West German. They were perhaps of different ethnicities, but America allowed that possibility, even though they married in the Netherlands. But within a kind of standard American story. And they work hard, they establish themselves, and their kids are successful. That whatever, they go to the Ivy League schools and they become rich lawyers and doctors and eye bankers or whatever. So one could tell that story, Anthony and Caritia's story, in that way. But one could also point to the fact that they were banished from the colony, right? That they're constantly harassed, that they are insulted for large parts of their life, not at the end of their life, but for large parts of their lives. They are in some ways, a thought too far to think for the colony. And that's the reason they have to be banished to Long Island, even though they stay in very close contact with the colony and they're still, full-fledged members of the colony, I would say. But they don't quite fit, right? And I think, just not to be so presentist, but I think, after the Hart-Sellers Act, many of the people who, I represent, or, that I'm not saying I represent everybody, but I'm an exemplar of, immigrants whose children did very well, etc. That's a very happy story, but there's also, that there was a fair amount of conflict. In my own life, I experienced that, right? Plenty of racism, plenty of anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, whatever bias that one experiences, even if one is not Muslim, right? That's also an interesting history to kind of uncover, right? And I think Anthony might be useful here, is the way that Islam is used as an insult, right? The way of calling
Yes.
people who are manifestly Christian, in the case of Anthony and some Arab Americans, but are assumed to be Muslim, right? Or called as Muslim. Their Islam is asserted as an insult against them. Anyway, so there are all these ways in which there are echoes in the present of Anthony's story, and I think it's useful to kind of think that some of those issues that feel like they're very 21st century or late 20th century were also present in the 17th century. And so what does that mean for thinking about kind of cultural and religious politics in early America and then the United States?
Ultimately, are those issues related to the fact that we are minorities in such places, in these places where people experience discrimination and stuff?
I mean, sure, that's obviously a part of it, but there is a specificity, I think, to Islam in the story of let's just stick with the Americas, and that has to do with the long history of Islam and
Yeah.
Christendom around the Mediterranean, in a place like Spain, of course, but in other locales as well, of Islam as, in very broad brushstrokes for Christian Europeans, the largest kind of political, existential, theological threat, right? Of taking territory,
Yeah.
of winning converts, of capturing people, in a way that there are plenty of other minority communities, Jews, obviously. We might say different kinds of Christianity, but there is something specific to Islam in the history of European thought that is carried over to the Americas. So, of course, being a minority is a part of that politics, but it's different for different minorities. And so I think the specificity of Islam is something that we need to attend to.
Absolutely. In this particular case, for example, Muslims experience a different kind of discrimination than, let's say, the Mexicans or the Asians or people from other places who are not considered to be the real quote unquote Americans, that kind of thing. But as we expect that to change, at least demographically, the United States is changing. How far do you think the situation will continue as is in the future, or do you expect things to change because of the demographic changes that are bound to happen in the next, let's say, 50 years?
Yeah. No, I mean, look, it's always hard to predict the future, of course, but I think there's the demographic question of just more and what is the category we're talking about? Are we talking about Arab Americans? Are we talking about Muslims? Are we talking about the census category, MENA Americans, which I find a very odd category, but nevertheless. And all of those constituencies are a little bit different, I would say. But if we're just talking about kind of in the broadest sense, the kind of politics that we've been discussing throughout, yeah, I mean, I think there is a much more visible presence of Muslims in American politics. Keith Ellison, Mamdani, etc., Rashida Tlaib. So that I think necessarily will change things, right? It changes the conversation. I think conversations around the Middle East are changing in the United States. So, but I think we are in a moment in which, let's call them the new immigrants, right? So not the kind of historic immigrants to the United States, the various European ethnicities, Asian Americans, Latinx communities in the United States, all of which I'm not saying don't have problematic politics. There's not racism against them. Of course, there is, very obviously. But I think, Muslims are a newer, for the most part, in numbers we're talking about, and people from the Middle East are a newer immigrant group to the United States. And so I think I don't want to say they're experiencing the same kinds of politics that earlier immigrants did, but, not so dissimilar, right? Kind of push and pull, one step forward, two steps back. But it's, I think we are in that moment where that kind of politics is changing and Islam is playing a little bit more of a role in American politics, but not, I don't think, in any kind of grand sense at this point, right?
Yes.
And it's still the case that Islam is an epithet in the United States, in the way that people have spoken about all of the politicians that we mentioned, accusing Barack Obama of being Muslim, right? That still is a very potent thing in American politics, and hopefully that will change. But things are very slow, and I think it's it's generational. It's generational change, and the history of American cultural politics makes that very obvious. I mean, the history of Black Americans is obviously the lesson here, right?
Yes. Well, Alan, thank you so much for this wonderful interview. I'm delighted. To be talking to you from Tangier, Morocco. I mean, not Saleh is further down the Atlantic coast, but but I hope to continue my conversation with you on different subjects. You have a lot to offer, and I enjoy reading your works tremendously. And I look forward to your next project, whatever it is.
Thank you so much. It was such a great conversation.